There's a certain kind of person who doesn't quite fit anywhere. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way they complain about. It's quieter than that. They can walk into a room full of people their age and still feel like they are watching from slightly outside the glass. They know the references. They laugh at the right moments. But somewhere underneath, there's this low, constant awareness that they've always been slightly out of step with the world around them. They grew up fast. Not because anyone asked them to. It just happened. And now, as adults, they carry this strange double consciousness. One foot in nostalgia, one foot in exhaustion, and neither foot fully planted anywhere. If you've ever felt like you aged before your time, like you were always the old soul in every room, this might be about you. There's a group that psychologists and cultural researchers have quietly started paying attention to. Not millennials, not the core of Gen Z, but the generation that fell directly between them. Born roughly between 1997 and 2003. Old enough to remember a world before smartphones became the primary interface of childhood. Young enough to have grown up inside social media's rise. Old enough to feel millennial fatigue. Young enough to be grouped with Gen Z and quietly confused by that label. They've been called Elder Gen Z. And the psychology of this group is unlike either of the generations they are sandwiched between. Here's what's actually going on beneath the surface. Developmental psychologists have long understood that the years between ages 8 and 14 are critical for the formation of social identity, how we see ourselves in relation to other people, and how we learn to belong. What happened to Elder Gen Z during those exact years was genuinely unprecedented. They hit that developmental window during the collapse of old media and the sudden rise of early social platforms, MySpace, early Facebook, YouTube in its raw chaotic form. They experienced both analog childhood and digital adolescence, often within the same year. This isn't a small thing. Research in developmental neuroscience has consistently shown that the brain's social circuitry, particularly the areas responsible for identity formation and belonging, are deeply shaped by the emotional texture of that critical period. When that texture is unstable, inconsistent, or asks the child to navigate multiple conflicting social worlds simultaneously, the nervous system tends to develop in a particular direction, hypervigilant, adaptive, and almost allergic to the feeling of being trapped in a single identity. Which explains something that Elder Gen Z tends to experience but rarely has language for: a persistent, low-grade sense of not quite belonging to any one group, combined with an unusual ability to code switch, to adapt, to understand multiple kinds of people at once. They learned early that the rules could change without warning. So they became fluent in flexibility. But that flexibility came from somewhere. It wasn't a gift. It was a response. Many in this group spent their formative years in a kind of emotional acceleration. The 2008 financial crisis hit when they were roughly 5 to 11 years old enough to absorb the anxiety in their households, not old enough to process it with adult tools. They watched older family members lose stability. They heard words like recession and layoffs through walls. And then, almost immediately after, the world handed them iPhones and told them to perform joy online. The gap between what they were absorbing internally and what they were expected to project externally became a permanent fixture of their development. This is why Elder Gen Z adults often describe feeling, in some quiet, persistent way, like they are performing normalcy rather than living it. Like there's always a slight lag between what they feel and what they express. Psychologists call this affect regulation, the ability to manage and modulate emotional experience. But when affect regulation begins not as a skill but as a survival strategy learned in childhood, it leaves a particular residue. You get very good at functioning. You also lose the automatic reflex to simply let yourself be known. It's worth saying plainly, none of this is a pathology. This isn't something broken. It's a particular psychological architecture built by a particular set of conditions. And like any architecture, it has things it does beautifully and things it quietly costs. What it does beautifully is depth. Elder Gen Z tends to be unusually perceptive of social dynamics, of emotional undercurrents, of when something is slightly off in a room before anyone else notices. They have a kind of social pattern recognition that comes from years of moving between worlds, reading environments, adjusting without thinking about it. They understand nuance in a way that can be genuinely rare. They don't tend to see things as simply as the culture wants them to. What it quietly costs is rest. When you've built your nervous system around vigilance and adaptability, stillness can feel foreign. Belonging can feel like a trap. Committing fully to any one identity, any one group, any one way of being can feel like the beginning of a loss they can't quite name. They often describe this as restlessness, The sense that they should be moving, changing, becoming, even when they're exhausted. Even when what they actually need is to stop. The irony is that the people who are most capable of adapting to others are often the ones who most need someone to simply see them without needing them to be anything at all. If you've moved through life feeling like you're always translating yourself, always bridging something, always adjusting, this isn't because something is wrong with you. It's because you were formed in a space that required translation. You learned to see multiple things at once because you had to. That capacity doesn't disappear. But it doesn't have to be the only way you move through the world either. There's something deeper underneath the flexibility. Something that didn't get as much room to breathe. If you're curious about what that might look like, what elder Gen Z carries that they often don't have words for, there's more worth understanding.